Hey everyone, welcome to Tales in Text, and I'm your host Nisha, and welcome to another episode. And in this video, we're doing another book review. And no, it's not part of my Ancient Indian Classics list. This is a book that I recently listened to on Audible, and you may have heard of it. It's called Ghore Baire in Bengali, or The Home and the World in English, written by Rabindranath Tagore. This is a book that is immensely famous. It is one of those timeless literary gems produced in India. And Satyajit Ray has also made a movie of the same name and based on this book. So if you haven't read the book, perhaps you watched the movie, or you've heard of someone who's watched the movie too. So in today's book review, I'm going to be talking a bit about the book and what it represents, both what it represented in the past and what it represents today, and what it, I believe, will represent in the future as well. So let's dive right in. So for some context, The Home and the World was written in 1916 and published in 1916 by Rabindranath Tagore in Bengali. It was translated later into English by Surendranath Tagore, his nephew. And the book focuses on three characters: Bimla, a housewife, her husband Nikhil, also called Nikhilesh, and Nikhil's friend Sandeep. Now, this book is based, like I said, in 1916. So this is the time when the Indian national movement towards independence is growing stronger. The voices of the public for Swadeshi and for Indian-made goods, Indian experiences, for India's freedom, India's control over herself is growing louder and louder by the day. And you have people on both sides of the fence. And I'm not just talking about the British here, because the involvement of the British in this book is nil, although they are set in the background, you could say. Their influence is felt, but there are no British or other colonizer characters specifically in the book. This book really is kind of two-pronged. On the surface, superficially, it's about Bimla and her transition or her transformation from a quiet, subdued, very conventional, traditional housewife, homemaker, from that into this modern woman who takes the charge in terms of being more actively involved in the freedom struggle, as much as a woman could be during that period of time, and how she kind of moves away from this patriarchal image of what a woman should be, especially a married woman should be, into a version of an empowered modern woman. So that's the superficial story. But underneath that, Bimala represents India as a whole. And we see how Bimla's transition from this traditional woman into this modern woman is represented in India's transformation from being this country that is, I wouldn't say happy, but it's kind of passively accepting colonizers' rule. It's passively accepting being under the colonizer's thumb, into this country that wants to take ownership and responsibility and accountability for herself, into this country who wants to join these Western nations in their ranks, not as their underlings, not as their inferiors, but as someone who is on par with them, who wants to be treated with respect and dignity, and who wants to be given their place in the world. So this relationship between Bimla, Nikhil and Sandeep is the relationship between India, herself and her colonizers, India, the people who want her to remain this very, placid and flexible, kind of like the person who adjusts. In Kannada we say adjust madi. That's something that is there throughout India, that this Indian culture is all about. Let's just adjust and let's just put up with things, because why put our foot into the fire when we can just adjust and be flexible, right? So that is something that you would see represented in Nikhil, and then through Sandeep we see the ideals that people want for a modern India. People who are impatient with the fact that we've spent so many years under the colonizer thumb. Why must we continue to do so? We have our own ideas, we have our own vision for ourselves, and so we want that space and that freedom and that flexibility to uh, implement these visions on our terms as Indians and not as British India. So it's a very beautifully nuanced novel that weaves together both the domestic Indian life of a single household and a representation of India as a whole. What makes this really powerful is that, if you look at India, we always say Bharat Ma or Bharat Mata, right? Of course, the whole concept of countries, except for a couple like Germany, being considered fatherlands, most countries are considered mothers, right? But when you consider India, particularly the image of India as a country being represented by a woman, being represented by a mother, and specifically being in this India's image kind of equated towards the ideal woman, the Bharatiya Nari. That perspective has always prevailed, where India's morality, code of conduct, India's dignity, India's just her whole manner of being is reflected onto the women of India. We are Bharatiya Nari. India is the land of the Bharatiya Nari. So these are perspectives. These are things that most of us grow up hearing, right? And so Tagore taps into that belief structure that is ingrained into the Indian soul when he looks at Bimla and through that into India as this person who has been kind of cooped up in this zenana, right? India was also in her own zenana created by the British, and before that created by Indian rulers of different religions and different places, right? So India was in her own zenana, just like Bimala was in her own zenana. And how this woman, either that could be Bimla, that could be India, emerges as a butterfly out of a cocoon, or rather a gilded cage, you could say a bird out of a gilded cage, and transforms into this empowered individual. So the book, like I said, is extremely nuanced. There is a lot of conversation about, or rather, the conversations are mostly about the differences of opinion that people have in terms of how independence should be achieved. You have the usual refrain that most of us are aware of when it comes to how India's independence was achieved, in the sense that there were people who wanted to passively wait till the colonizers decided that they were done with the country and they just moved on. And then there were people who were like, no, let's take an active role in getting our freedom, getting our independence. And within that camp, there were people who were more of, let's do a non-violent movement, non-violent protest, and with patience, with kindness, with love, show the colonizers why they need to give us our freedoms. And whereas there was another camp which said, no, let's use guns, bombs, lathis, what have you, because these colonizers were victimizing us with violence, so let's play fire with fire, right? So you get this. The most of the conversations in the book are centered around the ways of achieving this independence and the role of Indian citizens as a whole in terms of how they can get independence, how they can become more Swadeshi, how they can become more self-sustained, how they can look at or rather contribute towards India's development, not just towards gaining freedom, but even beyond freedom itself. So a lot of conversations are about that. There is a lot of nod towards internalized racism, because that's a very real thing, right? We don't realize it even today, right? From our obsession with fairness creams to our, again, obsessions to go to these white nations, UK, US, Australia. All of these are because, to a large part, driven by internalized racism, where we believe that anything brown or brown created or anything rooted in the brown system is inferior to anything that is rooted in the white system, right? So there's a tremendous nod towards internalized racism, and there's a very strong theme of this crisis of identity, this conflict of identity, in the sense that we as readers and even Bimla, Sandeep, and Nikhil, all of us together struggle with figuring out which path, A or B, is right for us, or in this case, right for India. Uh, is everything inherently which is considered traditional India bad, and is everything considered westernized modern India good? Is one right and one wrong, or are there parts of both that have something good, and are there parts of both that have something bad? Because when you think of traditional India, we have to also remember the whole concept of, why the British were so successful here. Because they ingratiated themselves to the ruling classes, to the zamindars, to the Brahmins, to all the higher castes, and to people who had positions of power. They ingratiated themselves into that, into those systems. There is the concept of the belief of Atiti Devo Bhava, which is very prevalent, very strong in India, which kind of prevents us from seeing which guest has overstayed their welcome, right? So a lot of these very traditional aspects of India, conventional aspects of India, rooted in our psyche, Indian psyche, our cultural psyche, which predate the arrival of the colonizers, but which have contributed to colonization, right? So a lot of the discussions, a large theme, the feeling of the book is centered around, is every aspect of traditional India, conventional India, ancient India bad, and is every aspect of where India wants to go? Because India, in the book, the concept is that, for example, like I said, Sandeep represents the westernized modern India, but is India abandoning all of her morals, all of her millennia long belief systems and her behaviors, and aping Western culture? Is that truly good? Is that possible? Is that going to really help? Will that really make our colonizers respect us? Will that make us respect ourselves? So there are a lot of themes in this book that reflect the identity crisis and cultural crisis that took place even before independence, at the time of independence, and even today. As a modern Indian living in India, I can definitely sense that, crisis of culture, that conflict of identity within myself. Take, for example, this book which was written in Bengali, right? It's true that I don't know Bengali, but then I speak Kannada at home, right? So technically I'm supposed to be reading in Kannada, reading Kannada books, talking more in Kannada. But here I am doing an Indian reviewer doing a review in English, right? It's because I'm more comfortable with this language. It's because I learned this language more than my own indigenous or local languages, regional languages. And this language is the language that I work in, my day job that I work in. This is the language that I read in. This is the language that I live my life in, right? And millions of other Indians have also, or they are also going through this situation right now, where they are more connected to Western aspects of cultural identity rather than they are to their Indian roots. And yet, despite being very Western in our mindset and our behavior and our preferences, lifestyle preferences, we are still not considered on par with, people from America or the UK or Australia, what have you, right? One is, of course, because of outright blatant racism, but again, it's because the second is because, and especially people who are who are of Indian descent or who are of South Asian descent and living in these white countries will be able to attest to this and understand this better. Despite being on your citizenship card, despite being American, despite being British, despite being Australian, you are still considered an Indian because you look Indian. And so there is this problem of fitment, right? You don't feel truly Indian, but you don't feel truly of that white nation as well. Neither are you accepted as truly being Indian, neither are you accepted by the white man as belonging to his community. So this crisis of culture, this conflict of identity, right? It exists even today. And especially now when India is really fighting so hard to gain that global prominence, become one of the superpowers, not just economic superpowers, but even cultural superpowers, by adopting a lot of Western practices. But also, there are these lots and lots of internal issues regarding religion and caste, which we haven't been able to figure out, right? I mean, we are a country that is so diverse. We should have been able to figure this out, but we haven't. And so, lots and lots of problems, even today, with the way India is shaping up and what India will become. And I think that's why the relevance of this book really exists, because this book is about Tagore's own internal conflict, about his version of what India should be. You know, the India of the past, the India of the future, and what he feels India should be. And this is juxtaposed against, you know, very, very domestic affairs, because as the country evolves, the lifestyle of individual households will also change. Even today, you, as you are watching this video, your lifestyle today is completely different from, let's say, the lifestyle of your parents or your grandparents, right? So these cultural evolutions affect our day-to-day existence. So I think this book is definitely very timeless, because it was relevant in 1916 when it was written. It was relevant in 1947. It is relevant today in 2022, and as we move into 23, and I am very sure it will be relevant even in 2100 as well, because it touches upon themes which are inherent to the Indian soul. It's about Indian independence. It's about Indian cultural identity, or even the concept of identity. It's about India's place in the world, with how other countries view our country, and how other countries accept us or don't accept us as being their peers. And it's about how India sees herself and what she envisions for herself in the future. So these are themes that are perennial, these are themes that are eternal. And I definitely think this is a book that is timeless, that is going to have its relevance even decades and centuries into the future. And that's why we need to read this, not because of the domestic narrative that is there, which is outdated, of course, but because of the themes it represents and symbolizes. So yeah, so now that I've come to the end of this book review, let me just pull out a couple of tarot cards that I have. First off, I have the Hierophant. So the Hierophant is a card of the teacher, or the card of someone who comes in bringing these new ideas to you, something that you're not aware of. And they usually are in this position of power. They are usually institutional powers, or religious leaders, or community leaders, or people who take on group leadership, right? And who typically whose voice sways a crowd. And in this way, the Hierophant really represents the character of Sandeep for me, because of his role, which if you read the book, you'll figure out why I picked this card for him. But more importantly, the Hierophant really talks of, one, of course, the colonizers' control, the kind of control that they exerted on India, and the kind of brainwashing, the kind of political games that they played, and how they swayed the voice of so many Indians against each other. Because yes, while communal issues were present on smaller scales before the arrival of the colonizers as well, and I'm talking about Western colonizers, the white colonizers, to a large extent it was the arrival of the white colonizers that kind of cemented this hate between religious communities. And the Hierophant to me represents these issues of, religious intolerance, caste intolerance, the inability of these richer folks, or of people belonging to higher castes, their inability to understand, empathize with people who are poorer or who are of the lower caste, because all these issues are touched upon in the book very beautifully. And so I think the Hierophant to me represents, how one particular person's voice can really control the actions of so many other people, which, and in turn, affect the lives of millions more, right? And the next card that I pulled is the Sun, and she, incidentally, in this deck happens to be an Indian woman, represented by an Indian woman, or a person of South Asian descent, you could call, based on the kind of dress that she has on. To me, this represents Bimala and her experience, and through that, India's experience. the sun illuminates, right, and shows us things that we could not see in the dark. Similarly, Bimla and through her, the extension of India, when they get involved in the Swadeshi movement, when they get involved in the independence movement, a lot of issues come to light which remained kind of underground, which remained undiscussed. For Bimla, the character of Bimla, because she's a woman in 1916, she's always hidden inside the house, no idea of what's going on outside in the world. Very, very myopic view. Similarly, India as a whole, under the British thumb, under colonizer thumb, under the thumb of caste and religious intolerance, not really sure of, not even understanding the concept of, hey, we should get our freedom, because a lot of people, like I said, did not even think along those lines. There were certain groups which fought their way and, they started being vocal about the need for independence, and that's when it picked up a more nationwide movement. But for a very large period of time, people were very passively okay or just putting up with the colonization, right? So, but then to me, the sun represents this arrival of this new consciousness, wherein this new consciousness talks of wanting independence, wanting empowerment, wanting freedom, right? That's one side. And on the other side, the sun also represents the scorching heat, right? Exposing yourself too much to the sun for too long can scorch you, can burn you. And so to me, this really talks of this misplaced fervor that is very rampant in the book, especially in certain characters, because after a point you see that they lose track of why they are doing what they're doing, because the ultimate goal is to get independence, right? Or the ultimate goal is to set this mindset of Swadeshi. Because again, remember, this is still 1916, right? Independence is nowhere near. It's going to be a couple of decades more until actual independence comes. But these are the seeds that are being sown right now. And so after a point, you realize that this zeal, this happiness, the positive sun kind of turns around and becomes a negative sun, because some people just don't, they kind of lose the memo in terms of why they're doing what they're doing. A lot of personal factors come into play, a lot of vested interests come into play, and their zeal for Swadeshi just takes them down the wrong routes, which leads to a lot of trouble. So for me, the sun represents both the positive aspect of things that were in the dark coming to light, but also of misplaced zeal that could lead, or that has led India to a lot of problem as well. So again, if you read the book, you will be able to understand why I picked this card, but I felt this card was super apt. And again, finally, I picked the world card for very obvious reasons, because the book in its English title is The Home and the World, and Ghore Baire basically is a translation, that is the original Bengali, and the English translation is The Home and the World. And to me, the world card represents India's place in the world, and makes me really wonder, did we achieve the place in the world that we wanted to achieve? How has our home life, that is, when I say home life, I mean India's domestic experiences, India's cultural identity, been affected by India's arrival into the world as a modern state? And where are we going from here? So that's what the world card represents to me. So yeah, so this brings me to the end of this video. If you stuck around with me so far, thank you so much for watching. And you will find tons of other book reviews on my channel, so do go ahead and check it out. And I will see you next time in Tales in Text. Do let me know in the comments if you have read this book or if you plan to read this book. Alright, thank you so much for watching. Bye bye.